I got it. It looks like, if Mitch didn't.
All right. Keith is both here and first on the agenda. So why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Would folks like me to share? Share the agenda?
You're a little quiet, Keith.
1 sec.
But yeah, if you're able to share, that would be good as well.
Is that any better?
Yep, that's better.
Okay, cool. Would folks like me to share my screen so I can show the agenda? Might be easier.
That sounds
Sure.
good.
Cool. Let me do that. All right. So, yeah, my first topic is on. My first topic is kind of on behalf of steering. So we want to try to revitalize and get some more energy around the monthly community meetings that that Istio's had throughout its history, and it started back. We've had some really good ones recently, and I think that to make these community meetings successful, it would be great and to some extent necessary for maintainers to be able to prioritize attending. So before we make any formal changes or put any press out, I wanted to first kind of poll existing maintainers, aka this group here, to see do you all feel like the community meeting is valuable? If why or why not? If it's not valuable, what would need to change for you to feel like it's valuable? I'll say in the past, I know a lot of community meetings that I've been a part of are used to share updates about the project and to talk about new features, solicit user feedback. And just wanted to see, for folks who have a lot more history on the Istio community meeting than I do, would you be interested in using it for this purpose?
I was going to say, I think I agree with what you stated, Keith. When I used to attend, for me, it was getting more user feedback, or feedback into the development community from the users.
One thing that didn't always go well back in those days is that when we solicit feedback in an unstructured way, or in a way that no one who's joining the meeting really knows about before they get there, it can easily turn into like a Q&A session about, I encountered this one really weird bug, or maybe it's not a bug, on a very specific use case. Can you all debug my Istio? I think that's avoidable, but it requires some intentionality and communication up front, letting various users who might attend understand what to expect and know that it's not like a debugging office hours for Istio.
All right, I'm taking notes as well. Whoever's next, feel free to go. I think it was John.
Yeah, one thing I want to say is I know Lynn and Craig have recently been thinking about this as well, and neither of them are here. So you and or other people that care about this should probably sync up with them as well. I don't know what their thoughts are, but I know they have some. The question you asked though was, do we find them valuable? I feel like, to me, I don't find much value to them personally, but I'm also not the target audience, so that's probably fine, right? So I don't know how valuable it is to the target audience, which is the community.
That's Interesting. So, I guess in my mind, one of the things that is necessary for a healthy community meeting would be maintainer presence. And ideally, maintainers find these community meetings are a place for maintainers to get community feedback for the features they're working on, for direction of the project, et cetera, for prioritization. And I guess in kind of my perfect world, in the perfect vision for this, that would help maintainers find that sort of meeting valuable. I guess to John specifically, do you feel like you weren't getting that in these previous community meetings? Do you feel like there are other sources for that sort of feedback that are more useful? Care to give a little bit more detail into kind of the value that you might find from that feedback?
I mean, like, some of it's probably my fault. Like, I would say that I joined a few community meetings 4 years ago and found that they weren't terribly interesting, and then never joined again. So I wouldn't read too much into my feedback. But it seemed a lot of the stuff was like very high level, like intro to Istio, which is like not interesting to me, right? Which is fine. Like it's not meant for me. If it was, things like meaningful discussions with people about real feedback to Istio and problems they're facing and things like that, that's not a debugging session, which is very fine line. We've actually done some dedicated things like that in the past. Those were fairly meaningful. But I mean, we do also need to like figure out kind of what our goal of the meeting is and then work backwards probably. And I don't think the goal is to make it interesting for me, right? It's to make it useful for Istio users, I think, but maybe there's disagreement there. So.
Jeremy, go ahead.
Yeah, so go ahead.
Yeah, one thing I can find is like, what is the idea or the plan for getting more people involved in terms of like the users? It seems like I went to one or two. I didn't go to that many, but I didn't feel like there's a whole lot of users that attended. So I think we'd have to better advertise to get that kind of attendance that would make that kind of feedback valuable.
Yeah, so my logic for that question is I feel like we'll be able to get people to attend by putting it on socials and advertising, things like that. But I want to make sure that we're setting a solid expectation for what they're going to get when they get there. And that's kind of my reason for these questions. And we don't have to take too much time. I know there are some other topics on the agenda, especially on the CSR allocation. I feel like that could easily take a while. But there's not like a definite timeline here. But just so everybody is aware of kind of my thinking is that if we can tell people what they're going to get by attending a community meeting, especially because it's only once a month. But if we can tell them what they're going to expect, then they'll attend more, and they'll attend expecting to engage in the way that we tell them that the way we tell them to engage, for lack of a better term. And so, well, John is right that I think the primary end goal is for the users to find it valuable. My concern is that we get to a place, and I suspect that we may have already been in, as a community, may already be in this place where maintainers don't find it valuable, so they don't show up. Therefore, the users find it less valuable. I think that's the cycle I'm hoping to break by kind of going down this line of reasoning. But this is super helpful. I appreciate folks who have given their thoughts. Any last things people want to add? No, Eric, you were starting to talk at one point.
Yeah, I agree with most of the stuff that's out here, and Ben had typed some stuff as well. Or I think it's Ben. Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that we need to make it, for the community, and most of the presentations would be done by the community. It's sometimes hard to get them to do more advanced stuff, so maybe we need to, partially look at, our Istio Day sorts of things. What could we present there that would drive some attendance, and make make a good thing to show. And again, like I said, I attended it because, I was usually able to get some feedback from, what the customers were doing. I don't typically work with that many customers, so that was a good thing. I would entertain the idea though of, once a year, some, minimal number of times, the agenda item certainly could be, Q&A with the maintainers. As a potential item. But I agree, wouldn't want to do that every time, but I think that would be a good thing to do occasionally. And that was it for me.
Yeah, +1 to that. Solid idea. Okay, yeah, this is all I've got for this topic. Wanted to time box it. But if anybody's got feelings or strong opinions here, reach out in the TOC steering questions channel on Slack. Thank you.
All right, on to DNS. I think Ian was going to take this over. You're here, right?
Yep, I'm here.
Cool.
Sure. So we have a basic need for ztunnel/ambient to be able to have IPs allocated to service entries. And that won't really work with the way DNS auto allocation is implemented today. So John has gone ahead and put together a proposal for a V2 on DNS auto allocation. Would really appreciate it if folks could take a look. Costin, I see you adding a ton of comments. Thank you. But yeah, basically we're pretty early on. We're collecting requirements and whatnot, but there are some proposed implementations. Keith, are you still sharing? If you want to scroll down. I don't know how much folks need like background versus want to read it themselves. But essentially we could do some sort of mutating webhook. We're, I think, not real interested in that. Go ahead, Mitch.
Yeah, Ian, I was wondering if you could sort of frame DNS auto allocation before getting into possible ways to solve the problem. Could you help us understand what the problem is?
Oh, right. So when you create a service entry, you don't have to give it like a VIP yourself. You could, but that's possibly problematic. Might lead to mistakes. This isn't always a problem. If you're operating at L7, you could read other attributes to figure out like how traffic should move around, but ztunnel does not. So it's particularly important that ztunnel has some sort of VIP in order to be able to use the service entries. So like today, if you just go ahead and assign one, assign an IP to your service entry, a lot of stuff magically starts working, but without it, ztunnel really can't do much with the service entry. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Cool. So we have the mutating webhook. Generally, I think the project would like to get away from webhooks. So this is probably not super preferred, but basically at service entry creation, we could go ahead and assign it a VIP. Second option is to build like a controller that handles this. The details might vary, but seems fairly viable. As long as we can write the assigned VIP into the service entry somehow, status, annotation, just go ahead and put it right into the IP field. Then everything can read it, and the issue of sort of like late assigning it like the V1 implementation does should be resolved. Go ahead, Costin.
Before, I mean, we are discussing all options are probably valid and they're not, options. We need to choose them. All of them can be applied and used in with different tools because that's not, exclusive in any way. My concern here is that we need to be able to operate with real DNS. So any solutions that we have should be applicable by a user who, is programming the external DNS with a controller. And for that, the most important thing is security, because Istio, in particular, service entry, is probably the most insecure API and most dangerous API we have. And we probably need to consider, RBAC is not really protecting anything. OPA is almost impossible to write an OPA that gives user control to say you cannot override google.com or you can override this entry. So I think having a dedicated resource for DNS or adopting one that, for example, someone from DNS, external DNS, which is, can be RBAC protected and is explicitly designed for programming DNS would be a far better option in all cases.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, so I think like there's a lot of overlapping problems. Like there's the issues of how should DNS capture work broadly in Istio, and like, is it secure? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? There's controversy there. I don't know that it should be necessary to solve that problem to improve auto allocation, as long as auto allocation changes are not making the problem worse, right? It's like if we had a bug in virtual service header matching, we should fix the bug in virtual service header matching, not say, well, now person that wants to fix bug in header matching, go migrate everyone to HTTP route. Like, it is something we should do, but we shouldn't block improvements. The other thing on the integration with external DNS servers, I do feel like that's something somewhat outside of scope of Istio, and we should enable it, but not make it the only way to do things. And I would think that this proposal actually makes it quite a bit easier, because today we auto-allocate these IP addresses, but they're internal to Istio, so nothing else can use them. With this proposal, now they end up on service entry, and something like external DNS could read it and populate DNS. Now, external DNS doesn't actually read service entry today, so they would have to, I think, as far as I know, maybe I'm wrong. So we have to do some work there on external DNS, but it would certainly be much easier, right? Like they read gateway, I think, or something. I don't know. Like what we have, like they could easily read an object that has an IP and a host name and populate DNS, right? Someone needs to write the provider or whatever.
John, I don't disagree with you, and actually I'm working on a change to external DNS to do this. And similar to put the IP address. I don't mind if absolutely having that IP written to a resource is needed. The question is, if we have this auto allocation continue to use service entry with the current model, where it's kind of accidentally programming DNS, or if we use a dedicated resource or either adopt a DNS entry resource from Veneto or create our own whatever, that can be RBAC protected. Because fundamentally, if we create a resource that is specifically DNS entry, then we can have RBAC, we can have some controls, we can have we have far more and again, if we start putting the IP address in service entry, we are kind of prolonging. We're adding an API that then would have to be backward compatible and will not be able to make the real change, which is fixing the security model of DNS interception and making DNS interception viable, which I think is very important to have, DNS interception to secure networks that don't have a secure DNS, but not at the price of making the network completely unsecure. So
why does a new object help with RBAC? Shouldn't they RBAC protect service entry? Or rather, if they're not protecting service entry, then why would they protect DNS entry or whatever we call it?
Because the service entry is used for a lot of things and can have arbitrary host names, and there is no restriction on. What do? You don't allow RBAC to anyone except the cluster admin. Namespace owner can put per namespace RBAC. It's first not documented, and second, just like with gateway API, the protection needs to be based on the names inside. You protect, you are allowed to set name foo.com, but you're not allowed to set google.com.
Okay, so there'd be a more advanced system than just don't give people
You-
access to the resource.
Or like gateway did, you restrict, you can do only names in your namespace. I mean, like in gateway API, HTTP route, you can only basically, or in Gamma, you attach to service.namespace.svc.
Yeah, the thing that I think is interesting is that with DNS auto allocation, the goal from the user is not to create DNS entries. They actually don't know, if they're not paying attention, that it's even doing DNS. The purpose is really just to convey information between the application and the proxy, right? So it's kind of weird to require the user to create a DNS object.
That's true. Well, that's a user intent, and that's what we thought when we implemented these features, that is just a convenience for users. But I hope we all agree that it has a security implication, and it's effectively negating the entire security model in Istio, because, you know, if you compromise DNS, the entire thing is gone, because that's what application is telling the tunnel. So again, it's accidental, but that's reality. We need to accept it.
Yeah.
And for the record, auto allocation actually much better than what we are doing today. Is much more secure than allowing users to put arbitrary IPs, because that's really is a dangerous thing. So I'm not against auto allocation, and or definitely not against putting the IP somewhere. But I want to consider security this time because DNS is so critical.
So in the past, we had, I think from Kevin actually, had a proposal on adding more restrictions to service entries on who can create them and whatnot. Would it make sense to kind of revive some of that work in parallel? I think it kind of died off because we stopped working on the project, but kind of all thoroughly laid out and with options that we could go from there. Would it make sense to revive that, or do you think we need something? I don't know if you remember that. It was a while ago.
I don't remember. I mean, I'm not trying to block this proposal. I think it's super useful, and again, finding a way to explicitly reflect the name of the IP in somewhere in Kubernetes is super useful. Just want to make sure that we take security into consideration, not to stop or not do it, just to do it in a safe way. And the Kubernetes native option 3, for example, would work if we do it properly. And again, it's just tiny details about what we allow, basically. I mean, what restriction we can put on this. Maybe just a namespace is allowed to create those kind of entries that resolve my problem. External DNS does the same thing. I mean, they have, if you put a restriction, only this namespace is allowed to create entries, that kind of addresses my main security threat for this particular one.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think we could, like, there's definitely low-hanging fruit that we could be done today. Like, Keith and others added like well, I don't want to give Keith credit. I know a bunch of other, Whitney as well. Well, I want to give Keith credit, just not only Keith. The validating emission policy stuff. Like, we could potentially say like, oh, here's how you write a rule to restrict some types of service entries to some namespaces, or gatekeeper. I don't know if we care to take opinions as like a step 0. But I do think that there could be more as well. And I agree, it is an important problem to solve. And I think, which I think is what you're saying as well, is that when we solve, like, we'll still need to do what's in this proposal. We just need to make sure it'll work with whatever security enhancements or scoping or whatever we do. But they probably will, because that's more, the scoping stuff probably lays on top of this, which is who is allowed to set up rules or get auto-allocated. But we still need a way to actually auto-allocate stuff, which would then go to this layer. So we may just do reject auto-allocating in some cases, I would imagine. Does that sound right?
I would reject that. I mean, what I had in mind as a quick fix, and I was working on it, is to have a setting to specify a namespace where DNS service entry can be normal service entry DNS and auto location is restricted. and all other service entries will be ignored basically. So if you want to do it, you can do it, but you need to be on this namespace, and only the admin of this namespace can modify DNS, which matches what external DNS is used if you use it securely, to where you can specify a namespace to tie it.
It's not really only DNS that's problematic from the security standpoint, right? Like it's all of service entry. Even if you can't say that google.com is now 1234, you can still say google.com as a host header match instead of an IP match goes to whatever IP I want, right?
That's true, but again, that's also solving this problem incidentally. But,
yeah, it just seems like we should
at a time.
solve service entry holistically, not
I agree.
the DNS layer, in which case you could do something like, say, only egress namespace can create service entries at all, right?
As you said, one problem at a time.
Yeah, I'm just saying, like, do we need to solve something at the DNS auto allocator layer that's part of this, or is it orthogonal and it's at a higher level at the service entry layer, and it can be, unrelated to this but happen in parallel?
For ambient, you don't care too much about headers, so it's not really a problem. And
That is true.
Ambient doesn't have an egress
only,
story.
yeah, that is true. Yeah, so for some context, I think it's briefly mentioned here, but one of the main motivations of this work is that today, if you create a service entry for an external service, you're very, very likely to be doing matching on host header or SNI. zTunnel doesn't do any of those, so it'll ignore those service entries entirely. So this is basically a requirement to get external service entry stuff in zTunnel, unless you happen to know the IP address of the external service, which you very, very rarely do. So that's some of the context there.
If that's a context, that's motivations, there are other solutions for that. I mean, you can have all those things redirected to a egress waypoint, which
but the
can
problem
do
is you
HTTP
need
and
to
that
know which things to redirect to the egress waypoint, unless you say all traffic.
Exactly. All public IPs for sure, and
Yes.
CIDR ranges for sure. And the one you don't is a CIDR range of services. So if you restrict.
Sure, yeah. If you have, there's use cases for that, and I think we should support that, but we don't actually, that's not always what people want, is to send all traffic, right? They may say, I want this type of traffic to go to this waypoint, this to go to a different one, and this to not go through at all. Like that's something people are familiar with Istio today and do.
People want a lot of things. Some things are safe, some things are not. I mean, it's our responsibility to give them this easy ways to be simple or safe and whatever. I mean, you know what I mean. It's I don't disagree with you that people have a lot of requirements or ideas, but this one is a very, very clear and safe way to do things. That solves 90% of the problems actually.
Yeah, the interesting thing though is that if we do that, then the waypoints need to be dynamic forwarding proxies, which they aren't today. So it's not
egress
just
waypoint, which you don't have, which will have to. I mean, it's kind of.
Well, that wasn't also the only motivation. I was saying one of the motivations is for zTunnel. Like DNS auto allocations used in sidecars and causes all sorts of issues with the instability of the allocation. So.
Yeah, I don't want to hijack that with security. I mean, let's go on, because I think we need to find the solution to do allocation. I think auto allocation is good, just if we are doing it properly. That's really my concern. Sorry for taking so long.
All right, do we want to go over the options, Ian?
Sure. I think we were partway through. We had talked that webhook was possible, but maybe we want to get away from that as a project. We have the controller. I think the basic option 2 controller would be just writing into the service entry somehow, status, annotation, right into the IP field or the address field. We also discussed a Kubernetes native, which is sort of in the works. There'll be like a service CIDR and IP address, and we could potentially leverage that. But it's pretty early on, and so it's probably not viable for us for a few years. But that would essentially be compatible with either a webhook or a controller. It would just be a different way of sort of storing or determining what IP will be allocated. And then we've sort of added an option 4, which is just create our own API for now and create it in such a way that we look to exit to option 3 once it's ready. Oh, yeah, Keith, the mutating admission policy, I think that is discussed in here as well as a possibility. But again, like you mentioned, it's sort of a ways out.
Those are two different things. There's a mutating webhook, which is like a HTTP call to our service, and admission policy, which is a cell expression. I think the mutating admission policy is going to be very, very nice for some bad ideas I have. But I don't know how you'd use it here because I don't know how you allocate an IP in cell. Unless I'm missing something clever. Keith, is there something good in mind?
No, that's why I said it's not relevant for this feature. But
Okay.
it was more response to the general goal of getting away from webhooks.
Oh, yeah.
And give folks some background, some context.
Yes. No, I'm super looking forward to that.
Cool. So does anyone have questions, or are folks just wanting to get into the doc now?
Speaking of webhooks, did you consider just using the Kubernetes webhooks for services? Basically, just create a service object automatically to a controller. We already do it for waypoints, and let Kubernetes allocate an IP. Basically, we have the service and we attach the service an external name, and it's kind of also visible to everyone. And
I don't believe we considered that.
I didn't write it down, but I had briefly considered it. I was worried about too many services and the cost of that. Like there's exhaustion issues. There's pros and cons. Like it's a very, one, you don't have this crazy IP range that is, it's probably better to use the service-sider range than our reserved range we use. There's a slight risk that using the service-sider range, people have expectations that that range is services, and now it's not. I can't come up with any ideas why that would happen, but who knows? But the main thing to me was the risk of just too many services and what that does with like kubectl and scale, and like even Istio will read them, although I suppose we could put the Istio ignore them label, whatever that label is. It's I think it's worth considering for sure. It's almost like a heavier weight way to do the IP address thing, but it works now, which is a big plus.
if you have a lot of IPs and services, you will probably, sidecars will probably suffer anyway because they get state of the world and all that. So we have scale problems anyway.
Yeah, but the service entries are only impacting Istio things and can be scoped with sidecars and whatnot. If you create services, it's impacting like kubectl, Prometheus, like all these different things. And
yes, that's actually the biggest problem I have. I mean, the service entry with sidecar scope and with export 2 is almost incompatible, and well, even for zTunnel, and I don't know how it works with your with the current implementation of DNS, because they are creating per pod split horizon policies really.
oh yeah, sidecar export is not respected in zTunnel.
And that's kind of, yeah. So basically, sidecars will have a different view of DNS, and then we get into all the other problems that migrations do.
Cool. Well, if you're interested in this, I'd appreciate it if you could check out the doc, leave some feedback. But otherwise, I think, Keith, we can move on to your next topic.
All right, thank you. Let me move over to this. Yes, so I wanted to talk through Gateway API manual mode. So I started a thread in Slack and wanted to kind of have more synchronous discussion on this here. So ultimately, the problem that we're trying to solve is we want to enable a user experience or a use case where a user wants to be able to do a very coarse blue-green type of deployment for their Gateway API gateway during an upgrade. This is possible with the Helm chart ingress gateways today. You can deploy the service, a service yourself, or modify the Helm chart to where it only deploys the deployment for revision and have like a shared service. But because Gateway API is a user-driven flow, meaning the user creates a gateway, the user creates a gateway resource, and Istio creates all the extra infrastructure in the deployment controller. This is a bit harder. So ultimately, what we want to happen is you want to do the same flow that we talked about, but kind of kicked off by the user. So for a single gateway, we want it to be possible for there to be 2 different revision deployments behind a single service. And this is, again, to make sure there's zero downtime and that one switch can't bring down the entire the entire system. There is the Gateway API manual mode, which, as I understand it, you essentially, if you set the address in the address field when you create the gateway, then Istio will not create the infrastructure for that gateway, and it'll just program it when it's ready. The concern that I have with this option and the UX of this option is that this is something that the user has to know ahead of time. They have to know what the service is going to be. If Istio appends the gateway class to the name of the service, there's some inside baseball the user has to know to be able to predict what the service is going to be. They could technically set it themselves and choose and make the decision based on what service they provision. But if you're like a platform team that wants to have more and do the whole blue-green thing that I'm describing, or if you're a vendor who wants to provide that kind of automatically, it's not super great for a user to have to put in their address, the address of the plus the DNS host name for the service ahead of time. That's just not a decision they should have to think about. So one thing that I'm thinking is to essentially create a in order to prevent all this manual work on the user's part, I'm considering potentially having a new gateway class that's like Istio manual or Istio unmanaged or something like that. That essentially, without the user having to change anything, they can just create a gateway resource, and Istio will know I don't need to create any infrastructure for this. I just am going to program it when it's ready, and that's it. And that's kind of nice in my opinion because it keeps the UX the same for the user. They don't have to think about address or anything like that. And then some other component, whether it's a controller or something, or a human being, can create the infrastructure to their specifications and do any kind of customizations that they like. So I wanted to first get folks' thoughts on this before going any further. John, go ahead.
Yeah, I have some thoughts, but a question before thoughts. Do you expect your users to know that this is different than open source Istio and or want to be able to configure on different gateways open source Istio deployment mode versus Azure Istio deployment mode? Or is it just they don't care when they're on Azure, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, they deploy a gateway and it happens to be created differently under the hood?
That's a great question. So I don't really care that it's like that the users know that it's a different gateway or not. Like I'm happy for this to be an Istio core. The reason why I haven't shot for it to be an Istio core is because it's really hard from what I understand of the of just how the deployment controller works. Because
yeah, no, I wasn't suggesting that we put that in core. Like I think there'll always be things that vendors may want to customize or whatever. What I was
Right.
thinking was maybe the user just creates a gateway. It says Istio. Istio's spec says that if you create a gateway with Istio, you will get a gateway deployed. Now,
Right.
in open source, we ship a deployment controller. What I was wondering is if it would be viable to just turn that controller off, run your own alternative deployment controller, either outside of it or in some fork of Istio or whatever you want to do. And then it's not like a new gateway class at all. You've just turned off the thing watching those, if that makes sense.
Or just change the gateway class to put a different controller name and so
Yeah, but that affects both, right? The same gateway configures the
But
programming.
I agree with
and
you,
the-
John.
Yeah.
I think that's the right solution. I mean, as a vendor, you should be able to, turn off Istio class controller and run your own. That's
Yeah, I don't know if
clean.
you can do it. I forget if you can already, but it would be
Well, with small code
it's an
changes, you
obvious
can.
flag to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, I forgot that there is a separate, or I guess I should clarify. So there's a separate flag for deployment controller versus the actual programming of the gateway. So those are the couple things. Yeah, that's definitely the right way to go.
Yeah,
wasn't
it's
aware of
right
that.
now. You could actually do it right now with the feature flag. It wasn't necessarily
I can see it.
intended as a permanent thing, but we could make it so, or not make it a. Yeah, that you found it exactly. So we could make it a more formal thing, or say that it's not a temporary thing or something. I think that's reasonable. At a previous company, we thought about doing the same, and I thought it was reasonable then.
Yeah,
It's nice
Great,
that they're
awesome.
separate controllers. It's nice that they're separate controllers. I mean, the deployment is separate from the actual.
Yeah, and I
Istio
think
router.
when we built it, it was kind of always intended that Istio would ship with a controller, but not necessarily the controller, right? Like you could imagine a smarter thing that is multi-cluster aware or something that spins it up across
Exactly.
multiple clusters, things like that. And I think that's good, especially now that the same stuff is used for waypoints too. You could imagine smarter waypoint deployers as well that, I don't know, put things in the right zone or something, or scale up or down. I don't know. There's all sorts of fancy things one could do.
And if you remember, when we started the whole gateway thing, that was one of the core requirements to be able to, have the actual deployment of the gateway be in a cloud, be in a different cluster, be wherever. So that's how it should work.
Yeah, completely agree. I think that this is exactly what I was looking for. Appreciate it. The other question I had is, I think there are like 3 different controllers for Gateway API, and I think is the status controller a separate controller?
It's kind of, but it's very tightly baked into. Like it can be turned off, but it's really baked into the configuring controller. That makes sense.
Okay, got it. Yes. Okay, so it's not part of the deployment controller. It is the thing I was wondering about.
Yeah, so there's like 3 controllers. There's the gateway class controller, which is very simple. It just writes a gateway class, and that's
Right.
it. It's like this hello world of controllers. There's a deployment controller, which we talked about, can turn off. And then there's a thing that actually takes the gateways and pushes down config into Istio internally so it can program XDS. That also spits out status messages. And then within that, you can optionally have something that reads the status messages and writes them the actual status. So I guess it's kind of 4, but the last 2 are very tightly coupled.
Got it. Yeah. So we could, in theory, even though you're doing your own deployment, IstioD could still be writing the status as long as status address is populated.
Yeah, I mean the deployment controller part, I think it's responsible for it. I forget. I'd have to check it. We went back and forth. It might be responsible for populating some part of the status. I don't see the word status in the controller anymore, so maybe not anymore. It used to write one of the conditions, but I think we changed that.
I think I remember that PR. Yeah, it's like the accepted is done outside deployment controller, and then programmed. Actually, there is a step when we're resolving hostname addresses in the deployment controller. I think we actually write status there for the programs. I'll have to double check.
Okay.
But this gives me what I need. I appreciate it. I think
Okay,
the only
so-
action item then is just to move it's just kind of codify that environment variable as something that's not going away then.
That sounds good.
Awesome. Thanks.
Cool. Costin, you're up next.
Yeah, since we have 9 minutes left, I was looking. I don't know if you looked at the bug with zTunnel and the certificate chain.
I read it, but I don't understand it yet.
Yeah, no, I looked at the code and my understanding of the API apparently changed with, I mean, it's no longer matching reality. If you remember, Istio CA returns an array of certificates. Last one is supposed to be the root certificate, and in reality, it can be multiple roots, so it's not a single element. And the certificate chains are in some parts of the code that returns as individual certificates. So it's you have an array of 5 elements, and each of them is the next thing. Another part of the code, especially in the kube controller that was introduced recently or at some point, they're all concatenated. Now, zTunnel seems to be concatenating everything blindly. I mean, just takes everything from the array and put it together and creates a certificate, and that should probably work. I have no idea how Rust is dealing with certificates and other things, but it's not very well clear what is the intent of the API anymore and what we want to do and how everyone is going to handle intermediate certificates. And Jackie probably knows.
Well, I was just curious if you were able to replicate this issue. I tried it with just a self-signed CA, and then I created an intermediary, and I couldn't replicate it with the zTunnels. I wasn't able to replicate it, so I was curious if you were able to.
No, I was not able to replicate it either, but I suspect, because with Cert Manager, I couldn't find any way to create a longer certificate chain. I suspect that with AWS and, at least with Google, it's use a root certificate, it will return you an already chained certificate. So basically it's a real root, which is offline, whatever, then a temporary root, and then you chain. So it's a 3 or 4 element chain instead of 2. Most of our tests are with 2. If you manage to do a test with a chain longer than 2, then probably you're closer than I am.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was able to, just following the documentation that we have in Istio for providing a plugin CA and specifically an intermediate CA.
Yeah, that's a 2. That's a 2 chain. So basically it's root certificate and then the cluster certificate.
Yes.
Yeah. By the way, since you are here, you did some work to get the TLS, CRT, and other stuff loaded in CA cert. Are you working to get it in the other code path, which is loading from cluster? Because it seems one of them knows how to deal with TLS, CRT, the other one doesn't. Or do you mind if I do it? I send a PR or something. It's kind of.
Yeah, I had paused work on that. So if you would like to move forward with that, please do so. I wasn't getting as many responses.
Okay, never mind.
So I had paused that work, but if you would like to move forward, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'll see if I have time. I don't want to step on your foot, but it's an inconsistency that is that's why.
Sure, we can sync offline too. On the same page. We can pair on that potentially.
Yeah, I would love more eyes on all that code path in zTunnel as well. I am definitely not TLS expert, and there's a lot of weird edge cases and stuff. So it seems to work in many cases, but obviously not this one. So
yeah, I'm not as familiar with the ambient mode, so I was acquainting myself with that flow, but yeah, not as familiar with that.
Yeah,
flow.
we could use like an internal audit kind of thing. Like I tried to copy what Pilot Agent does, but the libraries are obviously quite different. So
yeah, I think we are testing. I mean, both Jackie and I are testing now that code path, so it's we'll probably find what's going on. One thing I want to ask, probably it's for next meeting. there is a cert manager that is used for this intermediate certificates, and they have an Istio plugin that implements Istio CA, which doesn't have the tunnel hacks extensions, whatever you want to call it. Should we work with them? Should we? What's your thought on this? Because right now it's ambient. It's tightly coupled with Istio CA and that specific behavior with trust system zTunnel to mint on the same node and all the other stuff.
Yeah, so one thing you can do even today is use Istio D as the RA. So that does open up some integration possibilities. We had an issue somewhere that we were tracking, like what are the integration points for Istio, and one of them was about CAs. We never came to a conclusion. Like we don't want, there's like 5 competing standards. I don't think we want all 5, but we probably want more than the one least standard Istio one. But whether that's the Kubernetes CSR, SDS, file mount, Spire, API, those are kind of all the ones I know of. I don't know. There's
And there is a small sync, Acme, which is a small sync that people use.
It is I would be curious what that looks like with spiffy mesh. But yeah, I mean,
if you look at small step, there is a CA that is also integrated with cert managers. They have quite a bit of stuff, and it's starting to be used internally. There are all kind of Acme providers that are run internally.
Yeah, I know. I mean, Acme's great. I just wasn't sure what it would look like in a mesh spiffy context. Most of it based
Take a
on
look at Step CA. Take a look at Step CA.
They have non-DNS stuff?
They also have non-DNS stuff, yes, and policies and other stuff.
Oh, okay.
But we should probably consider also adding the DNS in the pod name, fully qualified pod name. I mean, Louis had the, there is the OIDC, the extra IDs for reflecting more metadata, I mean, node and whatever, but just reflecting the pod FQDN will improve a lot of things in zTunnel.
One random question with the 30 seconds we have left. It's related though. Like I saw an issue come through this morning. I didn't get a chance to look at it super closely, but do custom trust domains work with zTunnel?
They should. There's just one small bug that I think Ben was going to fix, and it's a trivial fix. But they used to at one point. They broke, and then we'll fix them basically.
Okay, cool.
Well, they should. I mean, I don't know. We don't have a ton of testing, obviously, because they broke, and no test caught it. But there's no.
You should be able to set a trust domain on zTunnel, though. Yes.
Yeah. What happened was on the workload in pod stuff where we sent over the file descriptor, we started attaching information about the pod, and that way we can join that with the workload information, so that we're not relying on the IP address for security checks. But part of the information we added was a trust domain. And in CNI, like the trust domain in Istio uses a global variable for some reason. And so we tried to access that global variable in CNI, but nothing actually sets it in CNI. So it was always clustered at local. So it would never match. But we don't actually need to do that match because we can identify the pod uniquely without a trust domain anyway. So we'll just remove the trust domain matching there. It would also probably be nice to not have a global variable for the trust domain, but good luck refactoring Istio to not use that anymore.
Well, how would you do it? I mean, that's the whole point of.
But yeah, you'd have to go past
domain.
You have to go past mesh config around everywhere, basically. So.
Right. Oh, but if at install time you pass the CNI install time you pass the trust domain, and actually by the suffix, I don't know people pay attention to the cluster local can be substituted with a custom suffix as well.
Yep. Okay, I think it's time for the next meeting, right?
Isn't this the next meeting? Oh no, it's not. Okay. Yeah, time for the next meeting. I think actually the global variable might not be so crazy to get rid of at this point. So we should maybe consider doing that because it's kind of not how it should be. Anyhow, see you all soon.
See you.